Okay, we're going to move forward now, and we're going to look at some proactive procurement anti-fraud reviews that we can conduct to identify anomalies, as Andrew mentioned earlier. And the first area that we're going to look at involves accounts payable and human resources testing. So that is going to involve our vendor master file, and we're going to be looking for items like incomplete records, shared addresses, tax ID numbers, phone numbers. It's also going to involve invoice testing. So we're going to be looking for things like even dollar invoice amounts where you wouldn't expect to find them, sequential invoices, and also invoice numbering. And by invoice numbering, I mean if you have a specific vendor and 99% of their invoices have an alpha character and a 6-digit number following, but you've got a handful of invoices that don't have an alpha character and they have 9 digits following, those are items that you're going to want to look at. So you can use software to actually extract those to give yourself a data set that you would want to review further. Next area is employee testing, and that would involve Social Security numbers, whether you have employees sharing Social Security numbers or employees using Social Security numbers that have not yet been issued by the Social Security Administration, shared addresses and shared bank accounts. Also potential shell companies. That could be vendors sharing information with an employee, whether it be addresses or bank accounts, or even vendors sharing this information with each other. So the first test we're going to walk through is going to involve potential shell companies, and this test is going to be comparing vendor addresses to see if we have multiple vendors that are sharing the same address. So previously I imported an invoice file and a vendor master file into IDEA. And from there, our first step is going to be to summarize our invoice file. So on the Analysis tab at the top, we're going to select Summarization. And once we get our pop-up window, we are going to summarize on our vendor ID. And the numeric fields that we're going to total is going to be line amount, because in this data, there's a line amount for each line on the invoice that rolls up into the invoice amount. And again, this goes back to something that Andrew mentioned earlier, is knowing what is in your data before you get it. If you summarize on invoice amount, that would give you a totally incorrect amount. So in this case, you need to summarize on your line amount. Down at the bottom where it says file name, we're going to name it Vendor ID Invoice Amount Summarization. And then our summarized invoice file is going to look like this. So we're going to have our vendor ID, how many records, which are lines of invoices for that vendor, and then the total amount by vendor. So you'll see what this has done. If you notice on the left-hand side in your menu, our vendor master file had 52,871 vendors, but most of them are no longer active for whatever reason. Could just be the time frame that we picked to do this review, but we've got 1,454 active vendor IDs. So now we've identified which ones those are along with their related spend. So then what we're going to do is we're going to join our vendor master file to this invoice data. What that's going to do is it's going to allow us to join the summarization that we just created with our vendor information. So we're going to have vendor name, vendor address, and relevant information that way. So what we're going to do on our Analysis tab is select Join, and then we're going to get our Join Databases box. Our vendor master file is our primary file, and then we need to select our secondary database, and in this case it's going to be the summarization that we just created, the Vendor ID Invoice Amount Summarization. We're going to name this vendor master file with activity, and for this we only want matches, so we select Matches Only, and then we select our match. We click on the Match button, and then we get our key fields pop up, and in this case we want to use Vendor ID as our matched item to connect these databases together. So once we join the vendor master to our invoice data, again, you'll see that we have our 1,454 lines. This is the tail end of the data, but you'll see we've got city, state, zip, the vendor ID, number of line items, and the total amount for each vendor. From there, what we need to do in order to see if we have duplicate addresses is to create a field. We're going to append an address number field. So what this is going to do is it's going to pull all the numbers only out of address field 1, address field 2, and then it's also going to add the first 4 digits of the zip code. We found over the years in doing our analytics that a number of times cities or towns will have more than one zip code. So we found that if we look at the first 4 digits of the zip code, because in a case where they would use 44121 or 44122, if they had the same physical address, it would probably end up in the same place. You can do this utilizing all 5 digits of the zip code, or even 3 if you want to cast a wider net, but we found that that creates too many false positives. We found that using the first 4 digits of the zip tend to work out the best. So we're going to append a field, and to do that, you can go to the Data tab and click the Append button that's boxed, or you can double-click within the data itself, and you'll get the same pop-up window, and you click the Append button that's boxed over on the right-hand side. We're going to name this field adding number plus zip4. It's a character field. We have to identify whether it's going to be character or numeric, and we're going to make this 20 digits long because that should be long enough to encompass any result that we may get. From there, what we're going to do is click in the parameter field, and we're going to create an equation that's going to give us the results that we were looking for. Now, Andrew mentioned scripting earlier. The great thing about IDEA is once you do a test, you can actually save the formula that you used, and you can pull it up at a later date, and then you don't have to create again from scratch. I will explain this formula very briefly. The all trim function at the beginning gets rid of any spaces, so you don't have to worry about those. And the reason that we do the just numbers for address line 1 greater than 0 before we trim those numbers off is that if it's a blank data field, it will insert a 0 if you don't give it that command. So we're pulling in the numbers from address line 1, address line 2, and the first 4 of the zip code, and basically this is going to concatenate them together. So if you look about halfway down the screen, under the evaluate box, you'll see 473718017700. That's the result from the first record in our database, which you'll see on this screen in the adding number plus zip4 column. So now that we have that field created for each of our 1,454 items, we're going to do a duplicate key detection search. So on the Analysis tab, we're going to click on Duplicate Key, and we'll get this pop-up window, and we want to tell it to output duplicate records. We're going to name the file Potential Duplicate Addresses, and we're going to click on OK. And once we do, it's going to ask us what field we want to use as our key. So we select the adding number plus zip4 field that we just created. And that yields us these results. Now, one of the things about this test and most other tests is, depending on the testing that you do, it can create some false positives. If you'll notice the 2 lines that are inside that block, you have 6831 Main Street and 6831 Halcyon Park Drive, both with the same zip code. Those are going to come up as duplicates. Even though we filtered out all the alpha characters, the numbers are still a match. So you would have to go through and filter those out, but you're going to see in a moment that the extractions that we've done and the summarizations have given us a much smaller database that we need to do that for than the entire population that we started with. That's also an indicator that if you used another program like Excel to try to identify duplicates, that they would not come up. And that's emphasized again if you go up a couple of lines to the 610 Herndon Parkway addresses. First of all, Herndon is spelled differently in the 2 occurrences, and then the first one says Suite 750 with suite spelled out. The second one says number 750 with the number sign. So those would not pull if you are looking for exact duplicates in software such as Excel. So in order to filter it down even further to make sure that we don't have any companies that are in fact the same that should have shared addresses, we can do things like look for shared tax ID numbers. So if we do our duplicate key analysis again, and we select as our duplicate key the NUM 1099 field, which are the tax ID numbers, it will identify for us all of the vendors in this population that have shared tax ID numbers. So you'll notice that the bottom 2 share tax ID numbers. You'll also notice the first 18 don't have any tax ID numbers in the system at all. In addition to our data analytics identifying potential fraudulent transactions, fraudulent vendors, it can also identify occurrences where the controls are not being complied with. In this case, this organization requires that every vendor in the system have a tax ID number, and in the case of these 18, that has not happened. So again, that's an additional finding, not necessarily fraudulent, but it's something that we can bring up, and then they can correct that. You'll notice the two that are blocked off that say Florida State of, that is one particular vendor that happens to be in the system 2 times. No reason as to why that is, but again, that's something that it's not necessarily a shell company, but it's a duplicate vendor master occurrence for that company. So what we can do to extract out same-name vendors, such as Florida State of, or any other occurrences that we might have, is go back up to our duplicate key analysis, and in this case, we're going to, instead of doing detection, we are going to do an exclusion. So we go up to our Analysis tab, click on Duplicate Key, and then select Exclusion, and then that will give us this pop-up box, and it says, okay, which fields should be the same? And in this case, the created field of ADI number plus zip4 is the one that we want to match. Field names that must be different are vendor name. So this way, if they have the same ADI number and zip4, but the same vendor name, it's going to filter those out. So we'll name this file Potential Duplicates Different Name. And then that gives us our result here. And you can only see the beginning of the population, but if you look in the box on the left, the potential duplicates different name, which is the file we just created, there are 56 occurrences. If you go up 2 lines to potential duplicate addresses, there were 58. Obviously, those 2 Florida State ofs have been extracted out of that, and that leaves us with these 56. At this point, once again, we would have to manually review for false positives, like those 2 with the same street number but a different street name. But again, now we're only looking through 56 items instead of the 1,454 that we started with. Our next area is going to focus